And it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer, really, standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes, and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com. Check out the latest blogs and forums. And while you're there, don't forget to like our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. We have a great one lined up for you today. Our guest is Shane Ryan, investigator of the Westall Flying Saucer Incident, one of my favorites that happened back in 1966 down in Australia. Today is a pre-recorded show airing on Christmas Day on the Dark Matter Radio Network. For those of you that celebrate, may you have a warm and happy Christmas. Next week, as all weeks ahead, we will be broadcasting live on darkmatterradio.net at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 1 a.m. GMT/UTC. Well, Santa brought me some new state-of-the-art equipment. Well, actually, with the help of your kind donations, our live shows should be of much better sound quality starting next week. I have a lot of people to thank for that. Some are monthly subscribers, and some of you have kicked in some generous sums along the way. I really appreciate that. Just a quick shout out. I want to thank you, Phil, for all your generous donations. Peggy, very nice. Matthew. A Michael that recently donated just a few days ago. Scott, who has been with me since day one. Gareth. Katie, besides donating from down under, she was instrumental in connecting me to today's fine guests. Thank you, Katie. And I know there's some people out there that I'm forgetting, and I'm sorry about that. Well, since this is the last show of 2013, I've been reflecting on what a banner year this has been. I got to go to a number of conferences, meet some wonderful people. We went from a bi-weekly show to a weekly show, and I could have never done all this alone. I want to first of all thank all the great guests that we had on back in 2013. And I also want to thank Michael Lauk, who had done some wonderful work with the news segment. However, Michael cannot be on our live shows as the schedule just doesn't work. I've gotten a ton of email for people wanting our news back. So Sam Maranto, who just joined us, he will be doing the news at the beginning of our show starting next week. And I also want to thank Sam for coming aboard. I certainly want to thank Peggy for the hundreds of hours she's donated in adminning our Facebook page. That page grew from about 2,000 likes up to about 6,600 now. She started posting the latest happenings in UFOs, astronomy, and technology every single day, and I'm indebted to you, Peggy, for that. Thank you. Mark Sima is helping us out from Beijing as our China UFO correspondent. Thank you, Mark. I also want to thank you, Phil, for suggesting me to Keith Rowland for the Dark Matter Radio Network. Thank you, Phil, and also thank you, Keith, for the great job you're doing. I'm getting close to the end now. I want to thank Kerry Lloyd Whitehouse for the music he provides for the show. He made our intro and outro. Thank you, Kerry. And lastly, I want to thank the most important part of the show, and that is you, our listener. Thank you for listening. Thank you for spreading the word about the show and the great reviews you have left, and all the feedback I get from you through email, good and bad. You can contact me, by the way, at martin@podcastufo.com. We have 79 free podcasts on our podcastufo.com website, plus blogs and our forum. You can always find pertinent links to our shows in our show notes every single week. Well, that's enough of me rambling. Hang in there, and we'll be right back with our hour and 20-minute interview with Shane Ryan on the Westall Flying Saucer Incident. All right, I'm with Shane Ryan in Australia, and I'm traveling into the future. You're a day ahead of me. How are you, Shane?
G'day, Martin. Hello from Canberra, and very warm greetings from Canberra. And literally so, it's a very warm 36 degrees here today, which is about 97 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's lovely to be part of your program, and Merry Christmas to everybody who's listening to this podcast.
Yeah, I know. I always forget about the opposite seasons we have. Well, not always forget, but I sometimes forget about it. And so you always live your Christmases in the hot times, and we're always freezing here, which it is right now.
That's exactly right. Santa Claus wears a bikini in Australia and goes surfing.
And this show is airing on Christmas Day, so how fitting. Yes.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah.
And look, it's a real pleasure, Martin, to be part of your program, and I really am grateful to you for giving me the opportunity to make this wonderful story about the 1966 Westall flying saucer incident better known.
Yes, well, I think it's one of the most intriguing cases that I've ever looked into, and I've always been really fascinated with it, with all the witnesses and the teachers and everything. For the person that is not familiar with the case, it was April 6th, was it, 1966?
That's exactly right.
So why don't you go ahead and give, like, a sort of in a nutshell, the story about what exactly happened?
Sure. As you say, it did happen 47 years ago in 1966, so it's not a recent story by any means, but it's an absolutely fascinating story, and it still, to this day, amazes me that it was able to stay under the radar for such a long time, and it was able to be, in many ways, I think, swept under the carpet and kept quiet. But, of course, in the memories of the people who were there that day, it was very much still alive as a memory and alive as an issue for them. But basically what happened was Wednesday, the 6th of April in 1966. It was the Wednesday before Good Friday, and so that means it was the Wednesday before the Easter break. In Australia, we have a long weekend for Easter, Good Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And it was also the Wednesday before school broke up for the end of term holidays, so holidays going for 2 weeks. And that's an important issue, and we might come back to that a little bit later. But the setting is a place called Westall, which was a neighbourhood, a community within the modern suburb of Clayton South, in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, about 21 kilometres from the Melbourne CBD. And the setting was a couple of schools, a secondary school called Westall High School and an adjacent primary school called Westall State School. And at about 10:15 in the morning, a couple of classes of high school kids were out on the sports ground, and one of the classes at least was playing cricket, another class was playing something else. And it was a mixture of boys and girls, and there were a couple of teachers with the classes as well. And then suddenly, completely out of the blue, completely unexpected, this flying saucer flew in. And it flew in completely silently, and the only thing that drew people's attention to it was the fact that somebody happened to look up and notice that it was in the sky. And, of course, the word went around very quickly on the sports ground that something was in the air, and that something was what the children immediately described, using the language of the day, a flying saucer. Mm-hmm. It had the shape of a bowl turned upside down, or, as one witness described it, a cup turned upside down and sitting on a saucer. So that sort of classic flying saucer shape that we're also familiar with now, of course. Mm-hmm. And one of the students, a Form 1 student, so that means a first-year high school student, broke away from the physical education class and ran into the school buildings and went straight to the classroom of the male science teacher, a man called Mr. Andrew Greenwood. And she raced into his class, flung open the sliding door and raced in saying, Mr. Greenwood, there's a flying saucer outside. And of course at that the whole classroom erupted. And the students got up from their desks and raced over to the windows. And at that time, from their windows in their classroom, they could see straight onto the sports ground. And sure enough, through their windows, some of them at least could see this flying saucer in the sky. Now, the teacher, Mr. Greenwood, was very surprised by this turn of events, as you could imagine, and he was very upset that this student had interrupted his class. And at that time, in 1966, a child doing something like that, of course, was really unheard of, that you would burst into a teacher's classroom and interrupt the class. He got rather irate, rather upset, and sent the student on her way and did his best to calm the class in front of him. He only had a couple of minutes to go, though, before the recess bell went. And when that happened, he went outside and he went out onto the sports ground, and all of the students from his science class followed, of course. And when he got out there onto the sports ground, along with all of the students, sure enough, there was this strange flying saucer-shaped object flying in the sky. And the recess bell had gone, so all of the students came pouring out of their classrooms, and very quickly, like a wildfire, the word got around the school that something was going on, and a lot of the students were very surprised to come out and see something that they weren't used to seeing, and that was all of the kids doing physical education, still in their physical education uniforms and hanging off the boundary fences. They'd all raced over to the boundary fences, jumped up on top, and were trying to peer at this flying saucer, trying to get closer to it, trying to get a closer look. And Mr. Greenwood, when he gave an interview on the subject the following year to a famous American researcher that you and your listeners would know well, Dr. James E. McDonald, he described, that's right, Jim McDonald, he described that about 3/4 of the school's 485 students were out on the sports ground and watching this flying saucer. For the students who were on the sports ground, they got, of course, the very best look at the flying saucer because they were there when it first appeared. And some of the witnesses have described the flying saucer flying so low that it came down at about the same height as the goalposts that were on the sports ground, or about the tops of the trees, and that it was so low that some of the students feared it was about to either land on the school property or perhaps it was going to crash. And for some of the students, this was an exciting experience. For some of them, it was a rather more frightening experience. And then, after flying around the skies above the schools, and when I say it was flying around, the students described the manner that this craft flew. It was quite extraordinary. One of the things that you have to recall is that the Southern Hemisphere's busiest airport, certainly Australia's busiest airport, Melbourne's second airport at that time, an airport called Moorabbin Airport, is only about 4 kilometres up the road from the two schools. And so the students were very, very used to seeing aircraft, especially light aircraft, flying around the skies above the schools. And so when this object appeared, it was immediately obvious to them that it was something completely unlike any aircraft that they had seen before. And in fact, to them it seemed obvious that it wasn't a plane, it wasn't an aircraft in the conventional sense of the word. And not only did it not look like an aircraft, it didn't fly like an aircraft. It sometimes hovered, almost as if it was standing still. Sometimes it would fly very slowly, and then at other times it flew completely erratically. It appeared to almost as if it could blink off on one side of the sky and then blink on again on the other side of the sky. And
wow.
The witnesses who have talked to me about this have said we're not sure if it was actually blinking off and blinking on again, or if it was just that it was flying so fast. That's how our brains, that's how our eyes interpreted the manner of its flight. And it would make sharp turns, it would fly vertically and then horizontally. So flying in ways that were completely unusual and unprecedented. And while doing all of this, the flying saucer was making absolutely no noise, or next to no noise. Some students remember it making perhaps a very slight humming noise. They're not completely sure because running at the southern boundary of the high school was in 1966, and they're still there today, high-tension power lines supported by huge power pylons. And sometimes the students would hear those power lines hum, of course. So whatever this object was, it was absolutely silent or virtually silent. And then after a few minutes of flying around, the object was seen to fly to a point about 400 metres south of the school, a place called the Grange, which was an old farming property which in 1966 was in ruins, but the physical property, the land, was still there, and it was an area that was well known to the students. And the flying saucer was seen to fly down there to a grove of pine trees, which were also very well known to the students. And then it was seen to come down, seen to descend, as if it was landing. And having seen that, and because the students did see it, so many of the students, in fact, a huge chunk of the student population, did what they knew was very much against the school rules, particularly in those days, and they left the school property. They jumped the boundary fence, they manoeuvred a ditch, a sewerage ditch, a drainage ditch that lined the side of the road. They ran over the dirt road that was at the southern boundary of the school and crossed into the market garden areas that were on the boundary of the schools, and ran down some dirt tracks in search of their quarry. And they were quite certain they, within a few metres knew where to run because they'd seen the object come down. And a small group of students, I'm not exactly sure how many, but at least several, were lucky enough, I use that term lucky enough in inverted commas if you like, to get down to the Grange in time to see the object still on the ground, or at least hovering very close to the ground. And one of the Form 1 female students, a girl called Terry, her name was Teresa Terry, she tells the story of getting down to the Grange a little bit behind the first group of students, and she arrived at the Grange in time to see the flying object either on the ground or just lifting up off the ground, and two other female students fainted in front of her, one still lying on the dirt, another one just picking herself up from the dirt. And there were a couple of male students, a couple of boys there as well, standing a little bit further back. And she watched in complete amazement as this object lifted up, again, silently, tilted onto its side, and then ascended into the air, and then, at an angle, flew off at an incredible speed and flew away within seconds, virtually. And obviously this was an incredible sight for this girl and for the other students who were there in time to experience that. For most of the students, they didn't arrive quite that quickly, and by the time they arrived at the Grange, they weren't there to see the object on the ground, but they found this huge circle. Some say there was more than one circle of flattened, swirled grass. The area around the pine trees was grassy paddocks, and the grass was all flattened down, swirled down, pressed down quite flat against the ground, swirled down in one direction. Most of the witnesses remember it as being in an anti-clockwise direction. And many of the witnesses recall there being a definite perimeter to the circle. The perimeter of the circle, the edges of the circle were discoloured in some way, as if they'd been affected by heat. Perhaps they'd been singed. Not that they'd been burnt, but somehow something had happened to the grass to change its colour. Mm-hmm. The rest of the grass in the rest of the circle, its colour was still the same. And many of the witnesses remember in the centre of the circle there was something like a hub. The grass was still standing and it formed a central circular hub in the middle of this much larger circle. So that's the story, at least up to that point.
First of all, I want to talk about the two girls that had fainted. I know, first of all, was there any speculation in why they fainted? And one girl, I understood, was taken away in like a ambulance and never came back to school. Is that correct? That is correct. In terms of the student witness who tells the story of seeing the two other girls fainted, she directly attributes their condition, of course, to the flying saucer that was in front of them. Now, she doesn't, of course, know exactly what happened. She doesn't recall the names of those two girls. And I've tried very hard over the last 8 years since I started my research to make contact with those particular girls, find out who they were, but haven't yet been successful. But, of course, for the girl who tells the story, for her there's no escaping the correlation between the flying saucer sitting there on the grass in front of the two girls and the effect on them. Mm-hmm. There is another witness, an older girl, a Form 2 girl, who tells the story of also being out on the playing field at the time playing cricket and saw the flying saucer when it appeared. And a younger student who was in one of the other classes on the sports ground went racing down towards the Grange in search of the flying saucer, and she chased after her. Even though they were a year apart in different forms, they were friends. And the older girl, whose name is Jacqueline, she raced down after her friend, whose name was Tanya. And Tanya was a much faster girl and got down to the Grange before Jacqueline. And about halfway down to the Grange, Jacqueline finds Tanya racing back again in the other direction, back towards the school. And by this point, Tanya is absolutely hysterical, crying, yelling out, weeping. And Jacqueline grabs her and tries to calm her down and tries to work out what on earth is going on. Why are you so upset? What did you see? Tanya won't tell her and breaks away from her embrace and keeps running back towards the school. At this point, Jacqueline makes the decision not to go any further, and she turns around and goes back to school as well. And she gets back to school in time to see Tanya being embraced by a teacher and taken into the teacher's care into the school. And sometime later, Jacqueline witnesses an ambulance coming to the school. Her friend Tanya being taken into the ambulance and then being taken away to hospital. And that was literally the last time that Jacqueline saw her friend Tanya. And the story that several students had been affected adversely by what they had seen, whether they were students on the sports ground or down at the Grange, was a story that was told to me by many, many witnesses very early on in my research. Some of the witnesses could remember the names of those girls. In fact, I was given 2 names in addition to the student called Tanya. And I have tried very hard to find those students. One of the students I was able to track down, but unfortunately, because as a teenager she had been given, for whatever reason, and I don't know the reasons, electroconvulsive therapy, ECT therapy. Wow.
As a teenager, at around that time, she told me, we spoke on the telephone, she told me, certainly I was at Westall High School, I have vague memories of there being a flying saucer incident, but because I received this therapy at around that age, her age was about 15, she literally has next to no memories of anything before the age of 15. And so that was an interesting addition to the story. Whether there's any connection with this particular incident, of course, I just can't tell. But that theme within this story, that there were students who were affected in an adverse way, is a theme that has been there from the beginning. Certainly that wasn't the case for all the students, not even for a majority of the students, but it does seem to have been an experience for some of the students.
Mm-hmm. Now, wasn't there a farmer that also saw something as well?
That's right. So Westall in those days was at the very southeastern fringe of Melbourne's suburban sprawl. So there were suburban houses on one side of the suburb, and if you like, on the other side, there were still lots of market gardens, farms. The area was just beginning to become a little bit more industrialised. And so abutting quite literally right up to the boundaries of the schools were these market gardens where vegetables were being grown. There were some orchards as well. And one of the witnesses was a 16-year-old farmhand, if you like. He'd been a student at Westall High School up until the previous year. He'd left, and he was now working on the market garden of one of his neighbours who lived also there in Westall. And he was down there with his boss and another farmhand, and they were pulling vegetables, carrots, out of the ground and throwing them onto the truck, getting them ready for market. And he happened to look up and he saw this extraordinary object come floating through the sky from the direction of the schools down towards the Grange. And he had a view of the pine trees at the Grange. And the object was flying very low. It was flying silently. And from the moment he first saw it, when it seemed to be quite a solid object, he had no doubt about that, it began to change into a more translucent object. It actually started to lose colour. It looked as though it was losing mass to him. He could actually begin to see through the object. And this was an extraordinary thing, of course, for him to witness, and it was very difficult for him to make sense of it. And he kept watching, and it flew down to the grove of pine trees at the Grange, and he expected a collision. But what happened was something extraordinary. It flew into the pine trees, but it was absorbed by the pine trees. He watched the object as it literally went into the centre of the trees and then disappeared. It vanished before his eyes. It didn't come out the other side. And he remembers thinking at the time that it was as if somebody was shining a huge light projection up into the sky, that this was being somehow projected into the air, into the sky, onto the trees. That was the closest he could, it was the closest thing he could imagine it to be, to resemble. Now, of course, this was virtually the middle of the day. It was a bright, sunny day, an autumn day, a cool day, but a blue sky, sunny day. And it was something, a memory, of course, which stayed with him, and has stayed with him all of these years. And then after he and his two companions saw this happen, within a few minutes, this huge swarm of kids from Westall High School came rushing over into the Grange. He watched them. They saw 3 people in the market garden, including himself. They paused as if they were thinking, well, this is private land. We're not supposed to be here. There are people there. What will we do? But they kept running, and they kept coming into the Grange, and of course they were looking to see where the object had gone.
Wow. You know, this thing you said earlier about it, like blinking and reappearing type of thing, and then almost like a projection onto the pines, it brings up the thought of the question that people have talked about, whether these things could possibly be interdimensional or what. You know, it just adds to the mystery in general.
It does absolutely add to the mystery. And of course, as I keep saying to people, I've done a lot of interviews about this over the last few years and have written some articles. And I often emphasise to people that I keep referring to this as a flying saucer incident. And the reason I do that is because that's how it was referred to at the time, using the parlance of the time and using that almost outdated, antiquated term sort of captures the feeling of that era, which is something I'm keen to do. Mm-hmm. But when we say it was a flying saucer, we say that because that's how it was described. It doesn't mean, and I'm not intending it to mean, that it was an extraterrestrial craft. I'm not intending to imply that it was something from another dimension or something from another time. I'm simply saying it was shaped in such a way, it was rightly and very aptly described by the witnesses as a flying saucer. Obviously, in the literal sense of the term, very much an unidentified flying object. But as to the provenance of the object and where it came from and who was behind it, this is the enduring mystery. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I'm still researching. It's something that I'm still very much open to a range of explanations. And of course, after you have, and this is something I've done from the very beginning, tried to rule out all of the prosaic explanations such as it being an aeroplane or a helicopter, mm-hmm. or a meteorological balloon or a model aircraft of some sort, or a kite or a drogue being towed by an aeroplane, or some sort of drone. Or after you've ruled out all of those more prosaic explanations, you're left with an enduring mystery. And I think it's fair enough to start thinking about some of those other explanations, of course. Obviously, people, when they hear the term UFO or flying saucer, within general society, within our popular culture, it connotes quite literally, in most people's mind, something extraterrestrial. Mm. And maybe that's the correct explanation in this case. I'm not at that point in saying that yet. I don't know that anybody quite is, but it's certainly interesting to contemplate the possibilities.
Absolutely. One of the things that I thought was really intriguing is I remember hearing that one of the teachers, a female teacher, took several pictures. And afterwards, I want to talk about the aftermath because I guess police or someone came to the school afterwards, but she was actually told to remove her film. Was that a myth, or did that really happen?
That's a good question, Martin. And a lot of these stories that you're alluding to, of course, feature in the documentary that I know you're familiar with, the documentary entitled Westall 66, A Suburban UFO Mystery, which I was very much a part of and which was broadcast on television here in Australia in 2010. And one of the stories in that, of course, is this memory that a lot of the students had of there being a teacher. Some of them identified the teacher as being the female science teacher, a lady called Mrs. Robbins. Other people remembered it as being the male science teacher, Mr. Greenwood. But the story was that there was a camera, it was a school camera probably, and that one of those teachers had taken photographs. Somehow, very quickly, had managed to grab the camera and took photographs of the object as it was still in the sky above the schools. And that camera was confiscated by people who came to the school. Now, some people literally remember being there, standing there, and watching as these two uniformed officers came and took the camera, with the film still inside, out of the hands of one of these teachers. Some of the witnesses remember it being two people in dark suits, not so much a uniform, but something like dark suits. But either way, two people, supposedly agents of the government in some respect, whether Air Force officers or police officers or from some other agency, people who, of course, didn't belong at the school, weren't part of the school community, had never been at the school before, coming and taking this camera away. Now, we've spoken to Mr. Greenwood about this memory. He doesn't think it was him. Unfortunately, in relation to Mrs. Robbins, her health is now so poor, we're not able to talk to her about these things in detail, and so we don't know really in any detail her side of the story in relation to this. So it's another element of the story that sits there as a memory that's very much part of the recollection of many of the witnesses, but one that's very difficult, of course, to prove one way or the other. Certainly, and very frustratingly, those photographs, whatever became of them, have never surfaced.
Mm-hmm. In your best estimate, how many witnesses do you think there were that day, and how many of those witnesses were actually teachers?
I mentioned Mr. Greenwood remembering a year later when he was being interviewed by Dr. James McDonald that there were around 585 students at the high school, not counting the primary school next door, and that about 3/4 of them were out on the playing field at some point watching this flying saucer in the sky. So we're dealing with a number somewhere in the vicinity probably of 300 to 400, because you do have to take into consideration the primary school students next door, and a number of those were witnesses as well as, of course, some of the local residents and workers. In terms of the teachers, I'm not aware of any primary witnesses amongst the teachers at the primary school, although there may have been. Certainly there are some secondary witnesses amongst the primary school teachers. But at the high school, Mr. Greenwood said obviously he was certainly a witness himself, and he gave an account of what he had seen to the local newspaper at the time. And he also thinks one, possibly two other teachers were witnesses, and he names those teachers in the interview that he gave with James McDonald. One of the teachers was a lady called Jeanette Muir, and she was a teacher from New Zealand, and she was one of the teachers out on the sports ground at the time. And Andrew Greenwood said she had been a witness, but that she clammed up about what she had seen very quickly and wouldn't talk more about it. And I tried very hard. Rosie Jones, the director for the documentary Westall 66, also tried very hard to track this lady down. We did manage to track her husband down, but unfortunately she had passed away just 2 years before, and so we weren't able to talk to her about it. So we're left with one surviving teacher that we know was a primary witness, and his account he has given to us on several occasions. And Mr. Greenwood, although he doesn't like to talk about the case much anymore, I guess for him it's a matter of it being something he's had to live with for a very long time now, and he's a little bit over it, I guess. He was happy to talk to me on a couple of occasions over the phone, and we also corresponded by email. And he said to me that he stands by the account that he gave at the time. He thinks that's the best account that he can probably give. But he did elaborate on one thing, and this was something which wasn't known at the time, and that was about a week after the sighting, he was at home and he heard a knock on the door, and he answered the door, and there were two Royal Australian Air Force officers there on his doorstep. And his first reaction was, they're coming around to take down more details of what it was that I saw. By that stage, his account had appeared in the local newspaper, but in fact, they were coming around to do quite the opposite. They had come around to put the hard word on him, and they said to him that if he spoke again in public about what he had seen at Westall, that he wouldn't teach again in the state of Victoria. Wow. He was a new teacher. It was, in fact, his first year of teaching. He'd graduated just the year before. And they said, if you give another account to a newspaper or any other media outlet, we will let people know that you're not coping with your teaching load, that you're beginning to take alcohol in the morning with your breakfast, just so that you can get through the day. There are no such things as flying saucers, and we don't want you to say that there are.
Wow.
And he said to me, Shane, even as clear as the memory of seeing this flying saucer is for me, even after all these years, the memory of these two Air Force officers, goons, he referred to them as, coming around and trying to threaten him and saying ridiculous things. He could remember, even at the time, some of the things were so ridiculous in terms of they were saying there are no such things as flying saucers. And then he said to them, well, if there are no such things as flying saucers, what does it matter to you if I say I've seen something like this?
Good point.
And so that memory of being intimidated, of these two men trying to both put the hard word on him and pull the wool over his eyes, was extremely vivid indeed. And it was something which at the time made him very angry, and I could hear the anger in his voice still, even after all of these years.
Wow. Now, has anyone else given a similar account of anyone approaching them in the same type of way?
Well, in terms of being visited by, if you like, agents of the government, there are a couple of other interesting accounts, and they both pertain to Westall High School students. One, again, was that girl called Jacqueline that I referred to earlier, who had tried to race down to the Grange with her friend Tanya, them both having seen the flying saucer in the sky. And she was actually called up to the headmaster's office. And she went down to the headmaster's office and was shown in, and the headmaster was there, but there were also two men that she'd never seen before. Two men in dark suits, not in uniform. She doesn't remember any insignia or any markings on their clothes. They had short, cropped hairstyles. And one of the men never spoke to her. The other man did all of the talking. And it wasn't so much talking as grilling. The man was saying things to her like, and I suppose you think you've seen a flying saucer, and I suppose you think you've seen little green men, and we don't want you talking about this outside of the school. There are no such things as flying saucers, and it's not going to be good for you if you try to talk about this outside of the school. You're not to talk about this. And she found this experience, she was all of 14 years old at the time. She found it very intimidating, very, very threatening, very frightening. The headmaster was in the room but didn't intervene. And that for her was one of the elements that was most frustrating and most agonizing for her, that her own headmaster wasn't there to protect her or intervene on her behalf. And she remembers she was so upset by the grilling and the nature of the conversation that she burst into tears, and she ran out of the headmaster's office and ran all of the way home. She was so upset about this.
Wow.
This girl, Jacqueline, of course, grew up to become a woman, and she became a psychologist and an advisor to a state government minister. And so she's a very level-headed person, a very well-educated person. And for many years she couldn't tell this story, partly because she'd been told not to tell the story. But now she feels very free to tell the story, and she wants the story to be better known. And after all these years, she thinks back on who those men might have been, and she thinks they were probably intelligence officers of some sort, perhaps from the Australian Domestic Intelligence Agency, known as ASIO, the Australian Australian Secret Intelligence Organisation, or some other organisation like that.
It's something like you always hear the men in black, showing up, and it doesn't matter what part of the world, it seems like these things seem to happen afterwards. And Now, I was thinking about all these witnesses we were talking about earlier, 300 to 400 witnesses. Now, they all went home to families of, say, each, connect to so many, and you get up into the thousands of people that are all, having table conversations at dinner about this whole thing. What happened as far as the aftermath and the media, as far as this thing going public?
That's a really good question, Martin, because in terms of the media, it was really a mixed bag. Fortunately, the local newspaper at the time, a newspaper called the Dandenong Journal, and it was a very well-read newspaper. It was almost the must-read newspaper for that local area at that time. It heard about the story very quickly. It sent a reporter down that very day, and it was front-page news for that local newspaper for 2 weeks running. And they tried very hard to follow up the story. They tried to talk to the headmaster about it. They made phone calls to the Victorian Department of Education. They tried various different avenues to try to get out of somebody some information about what on earth had gone on and caused this enormous reaction which happened amongst all of the students and some of the staff at the schools. In terms of the state-based newspapers, the Melbourne newspapers, interestingly, the two tabloid newspapers in Melbourne at the time, the Sun newspaper and the Herald newspaper, didn't pick up the story at all. And interestingly, in addition to that, they both, one the very next day and one the following Saturday, ran cartoons that made fun of the notion of flying saucers.
Wow.
A very interesting response, given that these were tabloid newspapers that generally were the sort of newspapers that would run flying saucer and UFO stories. And of course, this was the middle of the 1960s. It was almost part of not quite a flap, but there were a lot of flying saucer UFO stories happening around Australia at the time, including in Victoria. So it was a type of story that you would expect tabloid newspapers to at least say something about, and yet they didn't.
Wow.
The one broadsheet newspaper in Melbourne, the Melbourne Age, ran a small article the next day documenting the fact that a flying saucer had been seen, apparently, by several hundred students at these schools in Westall, by both students and teachers, and it posited the possibility that what they had seen was in fact a weather balloon, because a weather balloon had been set off in Melbourne that day. So again, that was an interesting take on the story, because the fact that a meteorological balloon had been set off that day was nothing at all extraordinary, because meteorological balloons were set off at 2 airfields in Melbourne every day, several times a day, and had been for years and years beforehand, and have, of course, every day, every year since. And not once in those preceding years or any following years has anything ever happened at a school in or around Melbourne that comes anywhere near what happened at these two schools in Westall on that day. So again, another interesting angle that was adopted by that broadsheet newspaper.
That's amazing.
But there was television coverage as well, Martin. I should mention TV. I shouldn't forget TV, because a lot of the witnesses, when I first approached the witnesses, and this is something I started back in 2005, and I started very slowly. I would contact one witness, and that would lead to another couple of contacts, and then that would lead to another 4, and it snowballed in that fashion. And nearly all of the witnesses said to me, it was on the TV news that night. Have you seen that? If you can get hold of that TV news film, that'd be fantastic. That'd be a great boon to your research, Shane, and we'd certainly love to see that again. Because a Channel 9 news crew came out to the school that day, and several of the witnesses, in fact, started giving interviews to the journalists and the camera people amassed at the front gate of the school. And a couple of the witnesses remember very clearly the interview being cut short. One of the witnesses, a girl called Joy, remembers a police officer tapping her on the shoulder, turning her around and saying, "Get back into school, back into school."
Wow.
And that police officer ordering the TV news crew away from the school. And then a staff member, a teacher, coming out from the school and taking her in. And those students who gave those interviews got dealt with very harshly. They were given detention, they were punished. But some of that footage had already been filmed and other footage was added, and it was broadcast on the Melbourne television news that night. And for many of the witnesses, they remember racing out to their parents or older siblings at home that night saying, Mum, Dad, come in. Look, I told you. I wasn't telling you a story. There it is. It really happened. It's on the news. We've tried very, very hard, of course, to find that TV news film, both with the Channel 9 TV News archive in Melbourne as well as in Sydney, but it's gone. No one knows where it's gone or why it's no longer there. It may simply have been thrown out or misshelved, as so much of that older archival material often is. There is, however, this story that's been there for a long time, that a federal government minister approached the proprietor of Channel 9 at the time and demanded that he take that film out of the archive at Channel 9 and send it up to Sydney from Melbourne, and that it hasn't been seen ever since. Now, that proprietor is long since passed away. Who that minister might have been, the ministers who might have been relevant to the case have long since passed away as well. So perhaps we'll never know. But I was able to track down the TV reporter who did the story that day. And he's only passed away just in the last few years. And he said to me, "Shane, I remember this story so well. There were a lot of UFO flying saucer stories being reported at the time, but there was no story like this, because this happened in broad daylight. There were so many witnesses. It happened at these schools. And when we got down there, the reaction of the kids, they were running around, they were very excited, they were all wanting to talk to us about what they'd seen, and they wanted us to know that what it was something extraordinary. They really had seen a flying saucer." And so I spoke to him about 45 years after the event, and he still remembered it very well, but unfortunately he couldn't shed any light on what had become of the TV news film.
Right. You know, one of my questions I was going to ask you is if you talked to any journalists, and had you been able to speak to any others besides him?
Yes, indeed. I was able to track down, and again, this was very much a team effort. I must mention here again Rosie Jones, the director, writer and editor for Westall 66, a suburban UFO mystery, who also did a lot of research, particularly with people who are Melbourne-based, because Rosie lives in Melbourne, I live here in Canberra, so she was able to do a lot of the legwork in Melbourne. And we were able to track down the original Dandenong Journal reporter who'd been sent out that day by the newspaper to cover the story. And he remembers meeting up with some of the students at the time at the school, and he was very wary of what was going on because he'd been told by the school authorities that he wasn't welcome, that he wasn't able to come onto the school grounds, that they wouldn't talk to him. And he knew that the students had been warned off talking to him or any other representatives from the media. But he managed to get a few students who were happy to take him down to the site of where they remembered seeing the flying saucer come down. And fortunately, we have his account, of course, written up in those Dandenong Journal articles. And he's been a great contact to have. For him, it's also something he remembers very well. It was something he wasn't able to provide an explanation for. But because he was a reporter there on the ground at the time, he was able to fill in and give us a lot of the sense of the atmosphere and the excitement and the complete disarray that the school was thrown into, because very much, and understandably, this was very much a concern for both the headmaster and the school staff in general. The school was thrown into disarray, and they were very, very concerned for the students. And they understood that their primary responsibility as teachers was to look after the welfare of the students. And of course, that very much explains a lot of their behaviour that day, and trying to protect the students and to keep the media at bay and to keep the students safe. But one other media person I should mention is a news stringer, a fellow who worked for a range of news agencies in Melbourne at the time, and he heard a radio broadcast, a news flash on one of the radio stations in Melbourne that something had happened out at Westall High School, and that the students had seen a flying saucer. And he jumped into his car. He was on the other side of Melbourne, working at the time, but he was from that part of Melbourne, the Westall part of Melbourne, and he knew the area very well and raced over there. And he tells the story of getting to Westall and meeting up with a police cordon. There were barricades set up, police cars, officers in uniform, and he couldn't get in. And he tried a couple of different entry points. He knew all of the entry points into Westall. They were all blocked.
Wow.
He couldn't close. And then he tried again later in the day. At the end of the day, the cordon had gone, the officers had gone, and he managed to go down to the Grange, and he saw for himself what many of the students had seen, these huge circles of flattened grass in the paddocks.
Wow. Now, when this documentary came out, did you say it was just a few years ago?
That's right. The documentary was broadcast on the Sci-Fi Channel here in Australia in 2010 and was rebroadcast again in 2011. Unfortunately, it hasn't had a television broadcast outside of Australia. It's had a few film festival broadcasts, screenings in other countries, but in terms of TV, only in Australia.
Well, the thing that comes to mind when I think about that is, with that being broadcast, did any new witnesses come out of the woodwork that saw the film and wanted to talk about it? Did any new information come out after that aired?
Martin, when the broadcast happened, there was almost an avalanche. We started receiving a lot of information from a whole stack of witnesses that I hadn't made contact with hitherto. People who had seen the broadcast, had seen the documentary, and decided to make contact with me, which was incredible. And we started gathering a whole lot of other information. A lot of the information, of course, was similar to what I'd received earlier. It was an affirmation of many of the other witness accounts. And one of the responses I'd like to share with you now, if you've got time.
Sure.
We received an email. This came through the website of the documentary, and it was addressed to Carmel McAloon. Carmel is the producer for Westall 66, and Carmel forwarded it on to me. And it was from a woman who in 1966 was a 9-year-old girl, and she was the daughter of a man who was a very high-ranking federal public servant at the time. And this is what she wrote to me. I'm writing to you because I hadn't realised there were so many other witnesses to an event that my father was involved with in 1966. My father was the 4th highest-ranking public servant in the Department of Supply in Melbourne. And just to let you know there, Martin, the Department of Supply was a huge Australian federal government department that was involved in the procurement of military equipment and hardware for the various military services in Australia. And her father had a particular responsibility for aircraft. And she went on to write that during this period, my father headed the team that selected the F-111 aircraft and was the senior defence point of contact for other Department of Defence senior officers. He was a brilliant intellect, a dux in high school, first-class honours in engineering. He had a science degree in electronics, and he did all of this in 3 years. He was involved in the setting up of the first radar in Darwin during World War II. He was a specialist electronic engineer. And he was involved in building the first computer in Australia. And she goes on to write that, I mention this just so that you know that he was not a fool or someone who would dream up what he saw. And she writes, I do not know how he was involved in the sighting of this object. He was, however, told by someone senior to him, and there weren't that many people senior to him, that if he were to speak of this incident to anyone, he would lose his job. He used to say that he knew what he saw. He was very angry that this event was not seen as an opportunity. He was intimidated on a regular basis about what he saw by other officials and told that a person in his position could not be taken seriously if he were to speak of it. He was a respected point of contact for the Americans, the French, and the Italians, as they were all in the market for selling us, being the Australians, their aircraft. Wow. She goes on to write, I knew about the object he saw from very early on in the event, and I was also told not to speak of it to my school friends, teacher, or anyone. I was 10 years old, and after my father said we were not to speak of it, my mother continued to talk to me about it, mostly because of the torment my father appeared to be going through over this Westall incident. My father came to work for the Department of Supply after he was approached for this position while manager of civil aviation in Sydney. He held this very important position in Melbourne with the Department of Supply from 1960 until 1968, then continued in this position in Canberra when the department's headquarters moved from Melbourne to Canberra until his early death in 1970. And she went on to write that she felt very strongly that whatever happened in relation to her father and what he saw at Westall and his attempts to get answers for what had happened and the way he was treated by the department, by agents of the government after that, that it very much contributed to his premature death just a few short years later in 1970. So after that initial email came through, we had a few other emails. I was also able to contact her brother, who was able to confirm much of what his sister had said, and he also confirmed that his father had gone out to Westall, had investigated what had happened, and that indeed he'd been dealt with very harshly, and that there was, at some level, some sort of cover-up, some sort of covering over of what had happened that day at Westall. Whatever it was, whatever was behind it, it was something that couldn't be spoken about.
Wow. What's your opinion of why do you think things like this are covered up? You think it's fear-based? You think it's national security? What's your thoughts on that?
That's a really difficult question to answer because it's a question that I ask myself every day, of course, and answering that question is an ongoing issue. And I guess, to be honest with you, when I started my research in 2005, I was hoping that I'd be able to find answers to what had happened at Westall reasonably quickly. I was hoping that I could find some sort of solution to this mystery. To me, it didn't particularly matter what the solution was. I was happy for it to be something utterly prosaic, something that was misinterpreted. Perhaps most of the story was an urban legend. Perhaps it hadn't even really happened. It really didn't worry me, but just finding an answer became important. And I guess being an Australian, being a member, a citizen of this country, which I certainly consider to be a very vibrant and quite successful democracy, a country where we certainly value freedom and transparency in government and open speech and liberties. And I think we're a pretty good example of those sorts of things in this world. We're certainly not perfect. No country, no democracy is. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to think that in a country like Australia, perhaps different from some other countries, and I won't name those countries, that sense of the covering up of these sorts of incidents that goes on, that sense of the ordinary citizen not being able to find answers, that wouldn't apply here, that wouldn't happen here. And here I am, 8 years after starting my research, still meeting blank walls, brick walls after brick walls, approaching various government agencies, trying to find a document trail, trying to find some sort of documentary evidence, paper evidence for the involvement by the many government agencies, both local, state and federal agencies, that so many of the witnesses attest to being at Westall that day and the subsequent days. And it's still an ongoing frustration. So I have to confess that it's been a really interesting journey, this Westall journey, and that I've learnt a lot along the way, but it's been, as most UFO researchers would of course tell you, and you yourself know so well, a very frustrating journey because there are limits. There are limits, I think, to what we as individual or as even group researchers are able to achieve. I think, in a nutshell, whatever happened at Westall, even after 47 years have passed, it seems to be that whatever it was, there must still be some sort of national security implications because it's still not talked about. The information is still not being released. We're not getting any public affirmation from anybody who might have been in charge at an official level at that time to what it was that was going on in Westall that day. And so one can't help but think that it has national security implications. Now, whether that means the people from the authorities who were there that day, whether they were Air Force or intelligence organisation or scientists or police, whether they were able to solve the problem, whether they even knew what had gone on, whether they had a handle on it then or even have a handle on it now, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. Perhaps they're as much in the dark as we all are. But we live in hope.
Right. I look at the statistics of the listeners of the podcast, and Australia is number 3 as far as the United States first. Secondly is the UK, and third is Australia, followed by Canada. And it makes me wonder if there's a lot of sightings in Australia and always has been. What's your thoughts on that?
I'm really pleasantly surprised to hear that statistic. I think that's wonderful. And good on you, Australia, for a country with only 23 million people, which is the population of some cities overseas.
Right, New York.
Yeah,
York
that's
City.
right. Exactly. So I think in like we do in lots of areas, we punch above our weight. But look, in terms of UFOs, most of my research is concentrated very much on this particular incident, but of course I've had to look at the wider picture when it comes to UFO sightings in Australia and to get a better feel for all of that. And certainly both at this time in the 1960s, but more broadly, there have been a lot of UFO sightings in Australia over the years and dating back all the way back to the at least late 1800s and right up to the present day. Now, it may be because we have a lot of clear skies in Australia and not so much light pollution. I'm not sure. Perhaps people in Australia do a lot of looking up. I'm not sure what it is. But certainly there's a very long and rich history of UFO stories in Australia. And of course, there's a whole range of wonderful UFO researchers that have gone before me and researchers who have researched the field much more broadly than I have. And you would know some of those people yourself, Martin. People like Bill Chalker and Keith Basterfield, and there are many others as well. And we have a very, very rich tradition in Australia of having flying saucer and later UFO research societies around the different states of Australia. And although the nature of those societies has changed a lot in recent times, they've become much more loosely connected, much more internet-based. There are still organisations operating, and I think that interest is still very much there.
Right. Now, just jumping back to the Westall area, was there other sightings close to that area? You hear about things extraordinary like this happening, and then they're either followed by sightings or there were sightings previously right in that very area. Have you heard anything about that?
Sure. Well, what happened in that particular week in 1966 around Melbourne was rather extraordinary, because there were two other fascinating incidents which did occur. One happened 4 days before Westall, so on the 2nd of April 1966, when a man was in the garden of his mother's home in a place called Baldwin, a suburb of Melbourne about 20 kilometres from Westall, and he snapped, using a Polaroid camera, a photograph of a flying saucer above the house. And if anyone puts in Baldwin UFO photo into their search engine, it'll come up very quickly, and for many people that photograph will be very familiar. It's been reproduced on many internet sites and even in books many times over the years. And the man who took that photograph, who's now, I think, in his late 70s, perhaps early to mid-80s, still after all these years stands very firmly by that photograph that he took. I don't know really anything more about that particular photograph than that, but that was certainly part of the scene, part of the milieu in Melbourne during that particular time. And then just 2 days before the Westall Incident, so on the 4th of April 1966, there was an incident you may have heard of, the bent or bending headlights UFO case. A man named Ron Sullivan was driving along a country highway in a place called Burke's Flat, about 200 kilometres from Melbourne, and he saw this light display off to the side in a paddock adjacent to the road he was driving on. And then a second or two later, the headlights on his car were drawn off the road, off to the side, towards the paddock. And he immediately began to lose control of the car, and he had to wrestle with the car, wrestle with the steering wheel to get it back onto the road and to avert a collision with the gum trees that were on the side of the road. And he saw this amazing display of lights ascending and descending in this paddock. And then on a few days later, in fact it was the day after Westall, the 7th of April, there was an incident, a fatality. Another man was driving along that very same stretch of road and collided with, apparently, according to Ron Sullivan, the very same gum tree that he'd narrowly avoided crashing into. And unfortunately, that other man suffered fatal injuries and was killed in that car crash. And when Ron Sullivan heard about the story a day later, he went straight to the police and told them the story of what had happened to him just a few days earlier in that very same spot. And that involved then an investigation, the newspapers. Ron Sullivan went back out to the site of the collision, and in the paddock where he had seen the display of lights, sure enough, there was this unusual indentation in the soil in this otherwise undisturbed paddock. And the Air Force came to Ron Sullivan's house and made an investigation of his car and checked the headlights and checked the car all over. And they assured Ron that they would send the report to him and keep him up to date with what they found, but unfortunately they never did. So those were a couple of other interesting cases which were happening just in that very same week in and around Melbourne.
Right. Now, I had heard that case about the vehicle being pulled and the fatality and all that. And it seems like there was another incident at some point in Australia where there was, I'm not sure exactly what, it was in the interior of Australia where a car was drawn off the road from a UFO.
Yes, I think you're referring to an incident which involved a family by the name of Knowles, and they were driving across the Nullarbor Plain, which is that extraordinary, very arid, treeless plain in Western Australia and South Australia, and there's a very long, deserted highway that connects Adelaide, the state capital city of South Australia, with Perth, the capital city of Western Australia. And that story happened much later. I can't remember the exact date. I think it was from memory in the 1980s, but I may be wrong. I think it was a very well-researched case. I don't know much about the final results of that case, but it was a case involving them travelling along and the car being lifted up at some point,
right,
and then being dropped down onto the road, and they were very much affected by what had happened. They were very distraught. But I really don't know much more about that case than that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so you have violent UFOs there.
I think we have the whole cross-section of UFOs, from very benign to less benign, which I guess is what you see in most other parts of the world as well.
Yeah. You had an opening for the Westall Playground. Can you talk about that? That was December 12th, just like 10 days ago.
Sure. Look, I'd love to talk about that very much, because one of the things that I think is really important to remember about this Westall incident is it's a very outstanding case, not just on the Australian stage, but on the world stage, because obviously when people in the general community think about UFOs, they think about one or two lights in the sky, someone perhaps out in the bush or in a country area seeing something late at night. But of course, the Westall incident was very different. It was a daylight sighting involving hundreds of people, children and adults, and it involved not just a sighting of something flying in the sky, but of course something landing and then leaving behind a trace in the grass on the ground. And then in addition to that, there was, and we haven't talked a great deal about this yet, but this incredible response to what it was that happened at Westall, this response by the government authorities, response by the police, by military officers, whether they were Air Force or Army, some sort of military officers. The Civil Defence Organisation responded. 2 separate fire brigades, a professional fire brigade and a volunteer fire brigade from 2 separate fire stations. The ambulance service was involved. So there was this incredible response, both at the school and down at the Grange as well. And so many of the witnesses, when I approached them and interviewed them, and please remember that, of course, at this stage I've been in contact now with 93 people who remember seeing the flying saucer and 145 people who saw the circle left behind by the flying saucer, and 59 people who were lucky enough to see both. So wow. It's a sizable number of witnesses, of course, and I'm very conscious as the researcher that there are so many more people that I haven't yet been able to contact. But nearly every single person out of that group I've just mentioned has said to me, you've really got to chase this up, Shane, because we saw people there in uniform. We saw the police. We saw the Air Force people. We saw the people in dark-coloured suits who didn't belong at the school that we'd never seen before. And so there must have been something very important that happened that day. And whatever it was, those people who came out, they just didn't come out for no reason. So, for me, getting recognition that all of these people had this experience, many of them as children, but also teachers and local residents and witnesses, that this experience had happened and that they'd been told at the time, very quickly, very early on, that they weren't to talk about it, that what happened at Westall was to stay at Westall, to finally, after all of these years, get recognition for them, to provide acknowledgement for them that what had happened had happened, and that this is part of the process of trying to find answers for them. So in 2011, I wrote to the Kingston City Council, the municipality that Westall is in, and I asked them to set aside a portion of the Grange. The Grange is now called the Grange Reserve. It's been turned into a park and a nature reserve. And I requested that the Kingston City Council just set aside some of that Grange Reserve as a park, a place that commemorates what happened in 1966. And one of the councillors in particular took up the cause on my behalf. He happened to be one of the councillors responsible for the Westall area, and he argued the case on my behalf in council. And as he said to me recently, he didn't have to argue all that hard. It was received very warmly by most of the other councillors. And later on in that year, they agreed to my request. And they went much further than I could even have imagined. And they have since developed this wonderful UFO-themed playground. They've completely reinvigorated the old playground that was there. They've replaced it and installed these state-of-the-art playground equipment. And at the centre of it is this amazing flying saucer-shaped object, which is based on some of the witness accounts in terms of the shape, in terms of the dimensions. They tried very hard to capture those elements. And in addition to that, and I was very, very keen for this to happen, they have set up, erected, interpretive signboards which tell the story of what happened from the perspective of the people who were there that day. So for me, it's very much about providing a space for the witnesses where they can go and feel some sort of recognition for what happened, and also as a place that continues to tell the story on their behalf.
Wow, that's great. Is there anyone else that has looked at making a documentary film, like, say, out of country? You know, like anyone in America approached you or have talked to you about making a film about this incident?
Yeah, sure. So in addition to the Australian documentary, we've got some very exciting news to share, actually. In February, I travelled to Toronto and was interviewed for an upcoming program that's going to be broadcast on the Discovery Channel Canada and Science Channel US. And it's a new 13-part series. So there are going to be 13 30-minute episodes starting on the 10th of January. So starting in a few weeks' time. And it's going to be called Close Encounters. And the Westall Incident, as well as a few other wonderful Australian stories, are featuring as part of this series. And I don't know yet at what point the Westall story will feature in the episodes. I don't think it's going to be in the first couple, but there's already a website set up for the Close Encounters program and a Facebook page as well. So they are beginning to provide information about it, and there's already a trailer out for the program because, let's face it, starts on the 10th of January in Canada, and I've heard it's going to be broadcast in the United States perhaps a few months after that, and then hopefully on the Discovery Channel, Science Channel networks in other countries around the world as well. And then in addition to that, just in the last few weeks, I've travelled down to Westall again, and we have done some filming for an upcoming series for the National Geographic TV channel based in the United Kingdom. And a film crew came out from London, and they're also doing a series on these wonderful, enduring, still unsolved UFO mysteries, and the Westall Incident is appearing as part of that series. And I don't yet know anything about the timing for that, but presumably it will be broadcast at some point on the National Geographic TV channel next year.
Wow, that's great. Well, you've been a wonderful guest. Where can someone find you to be able to send you an email? Do you have a website?
Absolutely, I do. There's a lot of information about the Westall Incident on the internet, of course. One of the best places to go is to the website for the documentary, and there you can see the trailer for the documentary. There's also a study guide that's been made for the documentary, a couple of those in fact, and there's just been released in the last few weeks a couple of iBooks for the Westall documentary, and they can be obtained through iTunes and iBooks. And you can also message me through that website, and the address is westall66ufo.com.au. And in addition, there's also a Westall Flying Saucer Incident page on Facebook, and that's where I tend to put a lot of the information, especially photographs in relation to the Westall story and developments in relation to the Westall story, such as the Westall Playground, on that particular site, and you can find that easily on Facebook. And there's also a Yahoo Groups website, and I mention that because that's the original website I set up way back in 2005 as a way of putting the feelers out in cyberspace to see if there was anyone out there who remembered the Westall story. And that was the initial contact I had, the initial point for contact I had from some of the original witnesses. And even though it's a little bit of an outdated format, it's still in operation, and there's a lot of information on that particular Yahoo Group's website, a lot of files and links and messages from witnesses. And if you just in your search engine search for Westall High School UFO on Yahoo Groups, you're sure to find it.
Wow. Well, great, Shane. It's been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and hope that this incident gets a lot more recognition worldwide.
Martin, thank you so much for your time. I do really appreciate it, and I know all of the people who are involved in the Westall Incident, the witnesses in particular, appreciate you providing this time, and thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to our show, and please remember to check out our website, podcastufo.com, for the latest blogs and forums. We will be back next week. Thanks again, and remember, keep your eyes to the sky.